Welcome everybody out there in Zoom land. So I am Christine Costello, and we have tonight Orion Aon as our presenter. So let me tell you a little bit about Orion Aon. He is an avid outdoorsman with a passion for all things wild food. He was born and raised in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he became interested in mushroom hunting at a young age. He moved to Fort Collins, Colorado in 2008 to study natural resource management and fisheries biology at Colorado State University. In 2015, he started Forage Colorado, where he shares his passion for edible wild plants and mushrooms, writes and creates educational content, and offers private foraging classes. So check out Forage Colorado for more information. And in this presentation, Orion will talk about the best way to start foraging, valuable lessons and experiences he's learned, important foraging safety information, and other tips and tricks of the forager's trade. And if I could ask everybody to please turn off your video and mute except when you're asking questions, that would make this presentation go much more smoothly. Thanks very much. So on to you then, Orion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction. And yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me all the way up there from down here in Colorado. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go through a little presentation that I put together. And then if you have questions, you can maybe put them in the chat or do the hand raise thing, but I have hopefully left some time at the end for those as well. All right, so today we're going to be talking about mushroom foraging and a little bit of plant foraging as well. My approach and sort of the way that I like to help people learn about it and have learned about it myself. So, there we go. I got a great introduction already, so I'll breeze through this. I've always been super passionate about the outdoors. I grew up in northern New Mexico in Santa Fe, where I lived on a little bit of forested land. And I've been fishing pretty much since I could talk. That was kind of my introduction into wild foods. Started mushroom hunting at age 10 when I was invited out to join a family friend on their trip. My dad, my brother, and I went with them, and we picked porcinis and chanterelles in the mountains of northern New Mexico, and that sort of became an annual tradition for us. Every year we would go out once we got the monsoon rains, and we would hopefully pick mushrooms, but as you all know, I'm sure, mushrooms don't always cooperate. And if we don't get the rain here in the Southern Rockies, we don't get the mushrooms. Off to college, I studied natural resource management. Again, kind of driven to that field by my interest in wild foods and the outdoors. And that added the scientific side to this interest in wild foods. I began becoming interested in mycology, joined the local mycological societies. We have a couple great ones in Colorado, the largest being the Colorado Mycological Society based out of Denver. And just sort of started self-teaching and asking people who were more knowledgeable than I was questions. And once I had a nice foundation of knowledge, I started helping people with identifications online. And that sort of stemmed into the interest in creating Forage Colorado. And Forage Colorado was originally slated to be a community, a place where people that were doing the same things that I was doing could share information and teach each other. And turned out there weren't a ton of people doing that. And so it kind of quickly morphed into an educational platform for me. It's always been sort of a passion project and a hobby for me, Forage Colorado specifically. And it's just sort of grown naturally in the 7 or 8 years since I started it. I would do 1 or 2 classes a year just when I had time, and that morphed into me offering private classes still when I had time, because I also work a full-time job in natural resources. And then it kind of morphed into a social media and online presence where I offer a lot of education on my Instagram, my website, and recently my TikTok, which I started last year, and it's been a lot of fun. So yeah, that's kind of Forage Colorado. So let's get into the basics of foraging here. You may, I'm assuming you all have various levels of experience in foraging since you're in a mycological society, but the basics of foraging is to search for food. And generally, as most people think of it, they kind of just include plants and mushrooms in that definition. But by the broad definition of the word, it could also include hunting and fishing. And it could include things like dumpster diving, as you can see at the bottom of the definition here. A man foraging a dumpster finds some celery. So foraging is a very broad term that just means looking for food. It fits really well into this sort of sustainability, self-sufficiency, and homesteading that has gained so much interest in the last 3 to 4 years, especially during the pandemic. So the number one rule that I always teach in foraging, and there are many others that are important to know as well, and some that come down to moral and opinion-based things. But this one, factually, is the best rule to know for foraging, and that is never eat any wild food until you're 100% confident in its identification and you're 100% comfortable with the idea of eating it. And that second half is something that I have added on in the last few years. Most foraging instructors teach the 100% confidence rule, but in my own experience, I've found that there are mushrooms and plants that I'm totally confident in identifying, but it's new, or maybe it's kind of an edible species that has some mixed reports, or some people have reported toxicity, personal toxicity. And so those sorts of species will sometimes take me a little longer to try while I do more research, even though I'm 100% confident in identifying it. So that rule, sticking to that rule, will keep you from ever getting poisoned unless you have individual sensitivities, which do happen from time to time. So we're all interested in mushrooms, of course. So let's talk a little bit about mushroom foraging. I'm going to go over identification. I'm sure that many of you are versed in mushroom identification, but we'll cover how I approach it. We're going to talk about eating new species and sort of my approach to that. Toxic mushrooms, of course, also important to know, not just the edible ones. I'm going to talk a little bit about plant foraging that you can do while mushroom hunting, and my approach to adding onto the foundation of foraging knowledge, because there's what feels like an infinite amount out there. So mushroom identification, this is something that maybe a group of mycological society members don't need to be harped on, but mushrooms should be touched and handled and observed and interacted with. That's the best way to identify them, and it's the best way to learn from them. So I always encourage picking, smelling, scratching, looking for staining, just spending time with them and understanding their niche traits and their small little details. Of course, taking lots of good photos before and after picking is important, especially if you'd like to get them identified online, which many of us do. And then, of course, bring them home to study further. You can see this beautiful spore print here of a species that I was trying to identify last summer while I was in Minnesota. And then the approach to identifying that mushroom can take a few different tracks. I know that you all probably have some resources at hand because you're in a mycological society. You can ask those that are more knowledgeable, but there are other options, such as consulting a book. If you can see behind me, you can see some of my library there. Most of those are foraging related, and many of them are mushroom books, generally like all of these ones and some of those ones. And I use those regularly when I'm trying to identify a new species. And because I have this foundational knowledge, I'm able to sort of start with a family or at least a group of mushrooms and sort of weed my way in there. But if you're starting with no knowledge, you can still use books. It's just going to take you a little bit longer. So most good mushroom identification books will have something called a dichotomous key in them. And that just lets you pick 2 traits and work your way through the chain of traits until you get to a species that fits those traits. Books take a lot longer to identify than posting a picture on the internet or asking your more knowledgeable friends, but it's also more rewarding, and the information sticks with you longer because you put in the time to really focus on each of those traits and try to figure out what that species was or is. Of course, the internet and social media are your other options, or some other options. When I was getting started, I used a lot of Facebook groups. I posted questions of my own, and I also helped people with species that I was very comfortable with. So that repetition built that species and helped me really kind of get familiar with it and add it to my knowledge. And then social media nowadays, you can reach out to people that you follow that maybe are knowledgeable. Of course, if they seem like they're very busy or have a lot of followers, they might not get back to you, but there are plenty of people that like doing identifications, myself included. I'm regularly helping people identify things in my DMs on Instagram and occasionally on TikTok and Facebook. So next, eating a new species. You've confidently identified it, you're 100% certain, and you're 100% comfortable. There's a few things that you want to try when they're new to you. The first is only one new species at a time. And the idea here is to prevent mixing different species, and then if you get sick, you don't know which one poisoned you. And then you have to go through the whole process again and maybe get sick again. So just eat one. Give it 24 to 48 hours, make sure you don't have any reactions, and then assuming that that is all good, then that's a good edible species for you into the future. Make sure you're only trying a small amount on your first time. Usually an ounce or 2 is plenty, and it reduces your severity if you were to have a negative reaction to that mushroom or plant. And then the final point that I like to add when I'm talking about eating new species is avoiding alcohol. And this is a pretty rare thing, but there are some species that maybe some of you know that can cause issues with alcohol, but are perfectly edible without it. And the main one would be like an alcohol ink cap or other members in Coprinopsis. But there are some other species that seem to maybe not play well with alcohol, and we don't know why that is. And I have a personal example of this that we'll talk about in a little bit. So avoiding alcohol when it's a new species, and then once you're comfortable eating it and you're not going to react to it, maybe adding that in and making sure there's no sort of weird individual sensitivity there. And of course, individual reactions and sensitivities exist. Allergies are weird. One person could be allergic to chanterelles. I actually know someone who can't eat burn morels, but can eat non-burn morels. So it's just kind of a weird thing that our bodies do. Who knows why? So let's talk about the toxic species a little bit, right? You can't be a forager of mushrooms and plants and not also know the toxic ones, because when you're identifying a species, you're also comparing it to the non-edible and toxic varieties that might look similar. And if you don't know what those are, you can't compare them. So there's an estimated 12 to 15 deadly species in the entire world. Here in Colorado, we only have 3 or 4 of those. And this photo here is one of them. It's our most common deadly species, and it might be your most common deadly species too. I'm not super familiar with your fungal population, but this is deadly Galerina marginata. It grows from decaying wood in our summer mountain habitats, and it's super common. I see it every year, multiple times. And obviously I'm very familiar with it because it's our most common deadly species. And it also looks similar to a few of our good edible species, those being wild enoki and honey mushrooms. Both grow from decaying wood and have some similarities to deadly Galerina. The non-deadly species, of which there are many, generally are just going to cause mild to severe GI upset. And often those don't require hospitalization, but sometimes they do. So the non-deadly but still toxic species should garner some respect from you anyways. You shouldn't just be out there eating mushrooms willy-nilly once you know the deadly ones. And then the final point to make about toxic species is, with an asterisk, there are no toxic to touch species. And I always say no toxic to touch species in North America, because there is one toxic species to touch, which is fire coral, that is a rare coral mushroom found in Asia and Australia. Really cool mushroom, but yeah, don't touch it if you do happen to find it when you're in Asia or Australia. But here in North America, touch all you want. So when it comes to mushroom foraging, there's also the added benefit of being able to forage plants. And because I have a lengthy background and a lot of experience doing this, I'm usually foraging plants and mushrooms at the same time whenever I'm out. You can see here in this photo, I have some shaggy manes, and then 2 plants that we'll talk about later in this presentation, lamb's quarters and feral asparagus. Here in Colorado, the spring, and this is kind of general in all sort of moderate moderate locations, moderate temperature. Coastal areas are different, but generally spring will be best for plant foraging. That's when plants are putting up their new growth, their tender growth that's going to be best for eating. Once plants start sending up flowers and seeds, they become tough and bitter. Summer and fall is generally best for fruits and berries, and often that's also some of the best mushroom foraging. And so you can sort of combine those and pick a lot of great things at the same time. I regularly will pick porcini mushrooms, which we'll talk about here shortly, and I'll pick huckleberries and raspberries. And then maybe when I'm coming out of the mountains, I'll find some plums and apples. So there's a lot of abundance out there that can be had once you learn them. And then probably my favorite thing to do is cook meals that are comprised of plants and mushrooms that grow in the same habitats and during the same seasons. And you can take that one step further and cook with animals if you are a hunter or fisherman like I am, or a fisher person, I should say. I love having meals that are comprised of entirely wild things that I've harvested. It's very fulfilling and regenerative. So we've talked a lot about how to kind of approach things, but how do you add this foundational knowledge that I've been talking about? This can vary depending on person, how quickly you learn, how quickly you become comfortable with new species, how long you've been doing it, what your background is in terms of what you study, how you approach learning new subjects. There's a lot of factors. But this is my advice on sort of how best to approach it. The first step is don't overwhelm yourself. There's hundreds of great edible mushrooms and hundreds of great edible plants, and it can be overwhelming to just want to learn them all and find them all at the same time. And I often find that new foragers become quickly overwhelmed. So my advice is to start with 1 or 2 species, really focus on those, look them up in your books, look them up online, see if you can go find them in nature, and really become familiar with those until you get to that level of confidence. And this process of becoming familiar to the level of confidence is doing a couple things for you. It's building this foundation of how you approach learning this new subject and these new species. And it's helping you develop pattern recognition, which is something that all of us do every day. Every decision that we make, every little thing that we're doing, our brain is recognizing a pattern that we've experienced in the past and basing its decision, its next action off of that pattern. And once you become aware that foraging is just pattern recognition, you can start to learn species more quickly, and then you sort of add onto this base of knowledge. And once you have that foundational knowledge, like I've said, you sort of have this library to compare new species to. So the more you know, the quicker you can learn new things, because you don't need to compare the new thing to so many other new things, if that makes sense. So pattern recognition is something that I always like to talk about, because I think it's super fascinating. You know, the tooth difference on a leaf of one plant versus another, or the cap shape, or in this photo, there are some blue chanterelles, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and some saffron milk caps. The top of a milk cap can look very nondescript if you're not familiar with them, but because I've spent the time to look at them and compare them to other mushrooms, I'm actually able to identify them just by seeing their cap. They have these very subtle sonate rings. You can see that on the upside down one on the right, just on the edge there. And then they also have this sort of fuzzy, grainy look to them that no other mushrooms have. That's actually because of their spherical cells. So sort of gaining that knowledge and building on it is takes time, but once you start, it sort of can exponentially increase over time. And then something that I do every year that I recommend other people do is challenge yourself. So my annual challenge to myself is 1 new edible mushroom every year. So I have to eat at least 1 new species to me each year. This year I only had 1. The previous year I think I had 8. But as long as I get 1, I've fulfilled my challenge. And I actually have a list, a mental list and a written down list, and they're actually different. But I have a list of species that I am 100% confident in, but have not eaten yet. And that can be that I only recently gained the confidence, or that I haven't found them, but I'm confident in identifying them, or I haven't found them recently. That sort of challenge, one, it sort of is self-motivating. It keeps you from sort of being lazy and being like, oh, well, I don't need to learn anything new because I've already gotten all these others. And I find that it sort of is motivating. You're like, okay, I know this species, I really want to learn it. How I have to go find it. And then you get out there and you start learning other new species. So I guess the moral of that is just get out there and start learning. So let's talk about some of the mushrooms that we have here in Colorado. And I'm guessing that because you're just straight north of us by a considerable distance, you probably have some similar species. But I know we have some unique ones to the Southern Rockies. So the first is the morels. We have yellow and black morels here, both burn and non-burn. And I'm not sure what your morel season, if you even have one, but ours is pretty interesting in that it can extend a lot longer than the traditional morel season. Generally, people think of morels as a spring species that you can get for a few weeks and then they're sort of gone. Here in Colorado, the last few years, people have picked morels from April to September. And the reason for that is they start in the low elevations around the urban areas in riparian and river habitats. And then as the season progresses and the temperature gets too warm for them, they move a little bit up in elevation into the canyons. And then at around 7,000 feet, the yellow morels stop and the black morels start fruiting. And those switch from river habitats to conifer forests. And then you can follow those all the way up to alpine. So we get a very long extended season, pretty special. It can be really good some years and really bad other years, but it's a lot of fun to be picking morels in the summer with porcinis and other summer mushrooms. We have several species of black morels. We only have a single yellow morel species, Morchella americana. And then we also have half-fruit morels. They're pretty rare. And we have the non-morels, but similar looking to morels species in Verpa and Garamitra. Those are also pretty rare. Next, the agaricus. We have tons and tons of agaricus here in Colorado. I don't even know what the number is. There's maybe hundreds. And I have the agaricus, that white book right there is the Agaricus Dictionary, Kerrigan's Agaricus of North America. They fruit like the morels from urban habitats all the way to alpine. I've actually picked small little agaricus in alpine habitats above 11,000, 12,000 feet. We, of course, also have the toxic Xanthodermis group, the chemically smelling bright yellow stainers. But once you become comfortable identifying those Xanthodermis groups, you can pretty safely eat any mushroom, any agaricus mushrooms that don't fit in that Xanthodermis group description. And I always like to talk about how interesting that is. You know, it sort of breaks the rule, that the number one rule that I want to have on having 100% confidence, because it's sort of a group instead of getting it down to a species level, because often the agaricus can be pretty hard to identify to the species level. And so if you can rule out the Xanthodermis group, then it's an edible species of agaricus. And so you can be not 100% confident of the species, but 100% confident of the edibility. So I find that pretty interesting. This mushroom here in the photo is the Colorado Prince Agaricus, Agaricus julius. We also have an interesting urban species, Agaricus bernardi, and there's another one that's like semi-bernardi or bernardiformis or something like that. These are a salt-loving agaricus that are generally found in coastal areas like in California, but they seem to have found a home here in Colorado and some other states that especially have a lot of salting on their roads during the winter. That sort of salinates the soil and makes it a good place for the salt-loving agaricus to grow. And then, of course, we have a lot of campestris and arvensis groups, group species. The arvensis group is the ones that stain sort of a faint yellow, but smell almondy, like the good edible agaricus. And many of our mountain species that are edible are in the arvensis group. Next, the most well-known, if we had to vote, the state mushroom of Colorado. We don't actually have a state mushroom, but if we did, it would be this one. It's the king bolete. We actually have two of them. So there are about 15 king bolete or porcini-like species, the edulis-like species in North America. The two we have here are Boletus rubriceps and Boletus borowsii. The Boletus borowsii is the white king bolete, and Boletus rubriceps, meaning the redhead, was actually only named in 2014, I believe, by David Aurora. So pretty recently classified. Like all king boletes, ours have a robust stem with reticulation, which is the netting pattern. And they're absolutely delicious. One of my most favorite mushrooms, and sort of the mushroom that I got started with. So I have a deep nostalgic connection with this one. These two species are mycorrhizal with spruce, fir, and pines. The Boletus rubriceps really prefers spruce, and the Boletus browsii really likes pines, particularly ponderosa pine, but it will fruit with some others. And generally, the beginning mushroom hunters are all starting with this one. We do have a pretty low diversity of boletes here in Colorado. I think it's less than 20, so it makes them very easy to identify. Whereas on the east coast of North America, they have hundreds and hundreds of boletes, which can get pretty difficult to identify. This is probably the most commonly, because it's so commonly known, it's also so commonly messed up. We have some scabrostocks, Lexinum species that people will regularly mess up when they're beginning. And we also have a lot of Suillus species. Those are both edible, although the Lexinum, we have Lexinum insigne and some of the other orange-capped ones that seem to cause a lot of toxicity issues here. It's the #1 most reported mushroom for poison control calls. So pretty interesting. It seems to be a cooking issue though, but we haven't fully figured that out yet. So of course, 100% confidence before eating any wild mushrooms. Next up are the chanterelles we have here. We have a single species of chanterelle in Colorado. That's Cantharellus roseocanis, or the rainbow chanterelle. They're very small. It's rare to find one that's larger than, say, 4 or 5 inches across. This year was a really, really good year for chanterelles, and I found a couple that were around 5 inches across, and probably the biggest chanterelles I've ever picked. They get the name rainbow chanterelle because from the top, their cap is sort of this like pinky orange color, sort of similar to a hedgehog. And I haven't eaten all of the chanterelles in North America, but I have eaten several. And I agree with the people who have eaten more than me and told me this, that the rainbow chanterelle is the best tasting species of chanterelle. I think because they're so small and they grow in drier conditions, their flavor is very concentrated. I always like to tell people that finding these is like finding nuggets of gold in the forest, because they rarely emerge past their cap margin. And so it just sort of looks like somebody dropped a bag of gold nuggets on the forest floor. And these are also pretty interesting here, is in that they're very hard to pin down. They will fruit in pretty much all of our mountain habitats, and they fruit very sporadically. It seems to be about every 7 or 8 years that we have a really nice flush. This year was that year. The previous time I had a really nice flush of chanterelles was, I believe, 2015. So right about that 7 to 8 year mark. The next one that we're going to talk about is lobster mushrooms. This is a mushroom that I just love looking for. It's pretty challenging, but I think it's very rewarding to go into a forest and find the little lumps that the lobster mushroom makes and dig up these bright orange mushrooms. Here in Colorado, these only fruit in ponderosa stands. And for those that are not familiar with lobster mushrooms, these are a parasitic fungus that attacks another mushroom and turns it into this bright orange fungus that you see here. Here in Colorado, our host species is usually Rustula brevipes, or the short-stemmed Rustula, which is sort of just a white, nondescript Rustula mushroom. Some years it's pretty tough because generally our ponderosa forests are lower elevations, and they can get some limited rains. But when they do get rain, it can be a whole lot of fun. This year, we had a really great summer, and one of my lobster mushroom spots had like 7 inches of rain over the course of a couple months. And so I went and picked lobster mushrooms, I picked chanterelles, I picked white king boletes, and I picked agaricus. Sort of a usually a very limited options in that habitat that was just full of abundance, and it was really fun to see. And then, as I mentioned, lobster mushrooms create mushrumps, which, if anyone's not familiar with that term, is when the mushroom pushes up the forest floor, soil, or duff and creates these little raises in the surface, or even sometimes just a crack. Next, matsutake, or pine mushrooms. These are highly prized and also very fun to look for because they, like the lobster mushrooms, create mushrumps. These, though, lobster mushrooms will sometimes peek an edge out and kind of flash you that bright orange. These here in Colorado rarely emerge, so you're really focused on cracks or little humps in the forest's floor. Our species is Tricholoma murrellianum, and it likes lodgepole pine and subalpine fir here in Colorado. It really likes pure lodgepole pine stands, but those are pretty boring to hunt in because they're very devoid of understory growth. And so I try to find the matsutake that are growing in lodgepole and fir because that's a little bit more interesting area to hunt. This one we also have a lot of lookalikes for. So going back to that 100% confidence and taking your time and learning them. We have the imperial cat, or Catathalasma. That one is also an edible species, more robust, but with decurrent gills versus the notched gills of the matsutake. And then we have some other Tricholoma species that are edible or inedible that can be easily confused with matsutake. This one is one of the few species that I have to smell to be 100% certain of. I've gotten better in recent years on going just off of visual alone, but especially Tricholoma caligatum can look very, very close. And so the smell of the matsutake, which if you've never smelled one, I like to describe as funky cinnamon candy. Others like to describe it as sort of resinous or piney or spicy sweat. This sort of like high, like funky high smell. And it's unique to matsutake. And once you smell it, you can sort of identify them just by their smell, which is pretty cool. So those are some of the best edible species. And of course, we have many, many more, but those are the ones that I wanted to highlight tonight. And now we're going to talk about a few interesting and rare species that we have here in Colorado. First up is an interesting species, the hawkswing, or shingled hedgehog, Sarcodon imbricatus. These sarcodons grow all over North America, and many of them get called Sarcodon imbricatus, but I think there needs to be some more DNA work, and someone needs to do a little more research on them because apparently, like the chanterelle, the hawkswing that grows in Colorado and the Southern Rockies is the best tasting of all of them. Many of them are bitter. Many of the other Sarcodon species are bitter. And even this Sarcodon imbricatus can be bitter or metallic tasting for some people. I know probably over a dozen people that find these unbearably bitter or metallic. My hunch is that it's a genetic thing like cilantro, but it hasn't been studied, so we don't know for certain. And as I mentioned earlier about avoiding alcohol on your first time trying a new species, I had a personal interaction with this mushroom and alcohol this year. I've been eating hedgehog or shingled hedgehogs for my entire mushrooming career, 22 years of mushroom hunting. I've been eating this mushroom, never had any issues. This year I ate some, and I also had a beer, and I had some fairly severe GI issues the following day for maybe 6 hours. So I don't know if that was something else that I eaten and sort of combined, or if I had just never eaten these and had alcohol at the same time. But yeah, it was not a fun experience, kind of like food poisoning. So I'm going to take it cautious with the hawkswing next time I eat them and do a little self-testing. But yeah, super weird to be sick the day after eating a mushroom that you've been eating your entire life. I don't drink a ton of alcohol, so maybe it's just that I'd never combined the two, but who knows? Requires some risky further testing, I think. It's one of my favorite mushrooms, so I'd be pretty bummed if I develop some sort of weird allergy to it and can't eat it anymore. There's, I guess, some other good ones too, though, so I'd live. The next is a rare mushroom that I've found the last 2 years now, and I've been super, super excited about. This is the blue chanterelle, Poliozellis atrolazulinus. This is a mushroom that I didn't find for 20 years of mushroom hunting. I didn't know it existed for the first 10 or so of those, but I never came across it randomly. And then 10 years of looking, like actively looking for it, I didn't find it until 2021. It was kind of a fun story. I had reports from other people around the state that had been finding them. It was a good year for them. And so I had one last trip planned, and it was sort of my last chance to find this mushroom. And just at the very beginning of the hike, I came across a small patch of them and spent some time just admiring and taking some videos and photos. And then this year I found a couple of huge patches of them, including this one here in the photo. They're an edible and very interesting species. Super sort of mild, earthy flavor that makes a really nice jerky. And a couple weird things about this one's name. Blue chanterelle, obviously, they have a similarity to chanterelle, but they're not a chanterelle. They're in Thelophoraceae, or the leathery earth fan family. And the chanterelle name just comes from the history of this mushroom. Back when they were first discovered, they were similar to chanterelles, and so they were placed with them and then later separated out into the leathery earth fans. And then recently, this was a monotypic genus, so Poliozellis multiplex was the only species in the genus. And I think in the last 2 or 3 years, they split it into 4 different species. And the one we have here in Colorado is atrolazulinus, which means dark blue. And as you can see, it is a very vibrant dark blue. The final interesting rare species is chicken of the woods. Obviously not rare elsewhere, but here in Colorado, super rare. I only know of 10 or 12 documented findings of this mushroom, and one of those is me. This mushroom here, I found, I knew of, it had fruited on this same stump in 2016. And this year I happened to check it and it was fruiting again. And it's on private property. I went and requested to take a sample, and I documented it on iNaturalist. And then I sent off a dried sample and a fresh sample to someone who studies Latiparus, and they cultured it and are going to hopefully figure out what it is. It's most similar to the white-pored chicken of the woods, Latiparus cincinnatus, but that one doesn't generally grow on ash trees. And this one here in Colorado was growing on an ash tree. And most of the other specimens that have been found here were also growing on ash trees. And then sort of just a fun find this year, someone in the mountains found a yellow-pored Latiparus growing from a treated 2x4 at a playground. Pretty weird. Probably one of the conifer loving species, but yeah, very interesting and a rare find. So yeah, chicken of the woods. It's one of my favorite mushrooms to eat, and not having it here is often frustrating for me. So luckily I know people, I have family in Minnesota, so I get to at least go there pick it on occasion, but it was fun to find this one this year. So let's talk about a few plants that you can find while foraging for mushrooms. These are all spring plants. So generally when you're looking for oyster mushrooms and morels is when I'm finding these plants. The first is stinging nettle. And this is a plant I love to talk to people about and surprise people with its edibility because obviously it's stinging. So stinging nettle is covered in these little stinging hairs, which are actually called trichomes. And if you zoomed in with a macro lens, you would see a little needle with a bubble on the end of it. And they're sort of like a hypodermic needle with a little chamber of acid that breaks off and causes the irritation. But luckily, those trichomes can be neutralized with either heat or crushing. And so you can actually eat nettle raw if you pulverize the leaves and crush all those trichomes. Nettles are full of nutrients. They have very high amounts of protein. They're absolutely delicious. They make a great cooked green. They're great in soups. And they also dry really well and can be used in teas and other sort of fun applications. I have a nettle ice cream recipe that's pretty cool. It's sort of similar to green tea ice cream if you've ever had that. And then another fun fact that I like to tell people is that there are people that use nettle to treat joint inflammation and arthritis, and they do so by whipping the inflamed joint with fresh nettles to sting that area. And it apparently helps quite a bit. I've never tried it, but I know it's reported to help. Next up is lamb's quarters. Many people call this wild spinach. It's in the same family as spinach, which is the amaranth family, Amaranthaceae. This is Chenopodium album, and it's one of our most common plants worldwide. It's cultivated in some places for food. It grows in most yards and gardens, and it's just an absolutely delicious plant and one that I think more people should be eating and not being angry that it's growing in your garden. They taste similar to spinach and the texture is similar to spinach, but I find it to be more deep and earthy and tasty. This, like spinach, does contain oxalates. So if you have problems with kidney stones or are sensitive to oxalates, maybe take it easy on this one or skip it. Cooking does help remove some of those, but it doesn't remove them entirely. In the spring, I really like to pick a lot of this one and then blanch it, which is just putting it in a quick boiling water bath and then freezing it and using later in the year like I would use frozen spinach. The final plant that I want to tell you about is feral asparagus. And I say feral because it is commonly cultivated, but it's an escaped species. So it was brought here during colonization when Europeans were settling, and they brought it as food. And it eventually escaped cultivation and naturalized all over North America. It's mostly spread by birds, and so it's often found along fence rows and ditches where the birds would land on a fence and drop the seeds. It would get established and then create new populations. Here in Colorado, it's in the lower elevations along ditches, rivers, and then county roads. And right now is a great time to go looking for asparagus because the fall color is a bright, bright gold. It just stands out among the dead brown grass. So look up what a mature asparagus plant looks like and then envision it bright gold, and that's what you'll be seeing this time of year. It's a great time to scout. This is the exact same species as the store-bought asparagus, but it tastes a lot better, in my opinion. It's sweeter and doesn't have that little bitterness that store-bought asparagus can sometimes have. And that is all I have. So, questions?
can see that Matthew has a question. You're welcome to unmute yourself.
Yes.
Well, yeah, I'm new to the Alberta Mycological Society. So I'll just introduce myself. I work for the GOA Wildfire Management Branch. So I'm out in the woods a lot. And I just recently started trying to grow my own mushrooms. I got pink and blue oyster mushrooms, and they did well, but my lion's mane didn't. It got some blue mold. So I threw that out. Do you have any tips for growing your own mushrooms?
That's a great question. I don't have much experience in cultivation. I'm interested in it, but I haven't had the time or space to get into it much. I've done some logs and just sort of inoculated them and then let them do their thing. So I personally don't have much experience, but I know a number of people that do, that I'd be happy to get info to you if you'd like. You can reach out to me. I'll click to the next slide where you can find all of my information, but feel free to continue asking questions.
Okay, and I guess for Mel, I live up in Peace River. Is there many people in northern Alberta who are part of the Mycological Society?
Yeah, we do have a good population up there. There's probably more that you could get in contact with through our Facebook group.
Okay.
You're welcome to just put out a shout out and see who else lives up there.
Okay. Thank you very much. And yeah, I enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
I did want to thank you very much, Orion, for being able to do this presentation. Part of the reason why I contacted you through TikTok is because Colorado does have a really big overlap in fungal biodiversity.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, so I do have a few questions for you, if that's okay.
Please.
So I know that you listed a ton of fungi in this presentation, but do you have a personal favorite?
So I do. My personal favorite would be the hedgehog mushroom. And the reason is there's a couple of reasons. The main reason is they just taste amazing. They're like a chanterelle, but a little more peppery, at least the species we have here. But also they're pretty rare. And so finding them is such a treat that it sort of has beat out the other ones if I had to pick one.
Thanks. That's awesome. Just kind of based off of you shared your negative experience with eating them and having a bad time. Have you ever put yourself in a dangerous situation while foraging? Like maybe coming close to some potential predator animal activity, or maybe, I know I've personally climbed many precipices in order to get to a fungi that I've spotted. Have you ever had anything similar to that?
I think probably the best example would be having to turn around while trying to cross a river in the spring. Like, I'm sure that my thinking is I'm sure there's morels over there and I have my waders, so I'm going to try to cross this raging river, and then I get like a third of the way in and I'm like, this is a bad idea. So generally that's probably the worst in terms of mushroom hunting. While out hunting, because I'm also a hunter, you get into some pretty rugged terrain. And so there's been some instances of cliffing out and those sorts of things where you got to backtrack several miles.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy. I guess my last question is, before opening up to anyone else who wants to ask, is you mentioned some bucket list fungi. Can you name a few of those?
Yeah. So the top of my list right now is the Hericium that we get here in Colorado. It's pretty rare, and it grows in a habitat that I'm rarely in during the time that it fruits. So it's a summer mushroom, but it grows in like the lower to mid elevation riparian areas off of cottonwoods. And generally that time of year, I'm up in the mountains looking for all the summer species. And so I just haven't spent enough time in the habitat it likes to find it. So that one, and then some more common species that I've just never picked that don't grow here would be like black trumpets. We don't have in Colorado. There's maybe in the non-edible or potentially edible, but there's a rare green staining ramaria coral that grows here that I've never found that associates with fur. And recently checked off my list was hen of the woods. I had never found hen of the woods, but
Oh,
found
wow.
those 2 years ago in Wisconsin.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thomas is asking if there is a key resource book that you would recommend for beginners. And normally I would add on to this that usually those books are very location specific, but Colorado does have a huge overlap of fungi that we do. So I'm sure that whatever ones you have to name would be useful to us.
Yeah, the two, we do have a huge fungal diversity, and some have told me that we have one of the top diversities after like North Midwest, like Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin area. So that's an interesting fact. But despite all of that diversity, we don't have a ton of great books. We have a couple written by people that are associated with the Mycological Society. So Mushrooms of the Rocky Mountain Region by Vera Stuckey is a great book for the Southern Rockies. And then Rocky Mountain Mushrooms by Habitat is also a great book for the Southern Rockies. And then the sort of encyclopedia that I always recommend is Mushrooms Demystified, of course. That's just a sort of great general North America book to leave at home and consult when you really want to get in and spend some time.
Nice. Okay, looks like Martin's got a question, so I'll give him the floor.
Martin.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a question as much as more of a, well, I guess it is a question. The question is, you guys have got a lot of aspen habitat up there, and we have tons of aspen habitat as well, both going up into our Rocky Mountains and in our aspen parkland. And you didn't mention a lot of mushrooms that you pick there. We've got a couple, and I'm kind of interested in some of the lexinums that grow in the aspen, like the insigne. But that's where we typically find our king boletes, and it's a white pored king bolete. Again, we haven't done the sequencing, so I'm not sure exactly what it is. We just call it edulus, so yeah, basically, are you finding lots in your aspen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Lexinum insigne is one of our most common aspen dwellers. It's one that I don't personally eat, or at least haven't eaten yet, because of those that high prevalence of poisonings by that species. But I think I will try it eventually. Other aspen species, chanterelles can be found in aspens here, although it's not their first choice, I would say. I pretty much only find wild enoki in the mountains on aspens. That species would be Flammulina populicola. And then we have an aspen oyster. I'm not sure if you have that species, Pleurotus populinus. And then after those, it kind of gets a little sparse. There's polypores that like the mountain poplars. But yeah, it's kind of just, I don't spend a lot of time hunting in aspen forests. If I am in like a mixed forest that has aspen, I will always check the dead ones for enoki and oysters. But rarely do I target aspen specifically, just because the other forests have more.
What time of year do you find your enokis?
Generally summer. Our summer season is July through September.
Yeah. I think we see some. I mean, we get some weird guys. I know in Calgary and Edmonton, we've had them come up in February. Which I'll tell you is the dead of winter for us. And so it's always exciting. You find a fresh mushroom, if you've had a couple of days of good weather. The other thing, you mentioned that all of your black morels are conifer associates. You're not getting any aspen associates at all in your morels?
They will fruit in aspens, but less commonly.
Yeah, actually,
Yeah.
well, yeah, depending on the year, sometimes we get really good fruitings in aspens, and they seem to be way tastier morels than any of the conifer morels that we find.
Interesting. The aspen species is the aspen fruiting species is the same species that fruits with our conifers in the non-burned areas. We only have 2 non-burned black morel species.
Oh, do you know which ones they are?
Brennium and Snyderi.
Yeah. So we have the Snyder, well, however you pronounce Snyderi, but we have that one, and I think we also get in the aspen we get the ones that kind of grow in the heavy humus, and which is Importuna, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one.
Yeah, that's one of our burn species, I believe.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Anyways, thanks so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
And Rosemary's got a question.
Of course.
My question is more on not the mushroom side, because I have foraged for other plants, but it seemed like those stinging nettles that you had in your hand, did you like pick them with your hands? Like, was that that just was what occurred to me when I saw the picture.
Yes, I did. I put that in there specifically to sort of entice that question. I've been picking them long enough that I'm not super bothered by their sting, but I also have just a method of handling them that reduces the chance of getting stung. The hairs sort of, they take pressure, it's like a needle. You have to push it into your skin to actually, inject something. And so if you're tender with them, they will sting you a lot less commonly. And then if you do, work with your hands and you have some calluses, they have a harder time stinging you as well. So.
Cool. Oh, it was just interesting. I saw that and I thought, wow, he's like Superman or something.
Yeah, I have some videos on my social media picking them barehanded, and people always freak out.
Cool.
Those nettles evenly distributed for where their stingers are. As far as I remember when I was a child, that they don't sting you on every part of the plant. It's just on certain parts of the plant, particularly in the seed area.
Yeah, they're most concentrated on the stem and the underside of the leaf. The top side doesn't have many or any. And then when they do have seeds, the seeds are pretty tightly clustered, so they're kind of, they have stingers around them as well.
I want to assure you that the aspen bolete is not as scary as you might think it is. We have eaten it all my life as culturally, and as I grow in this society, I have read that it has had the history of being of giving us toxic or some gastrointestinal discomfort to others. But if you cook it well and you treat it kindly, it will be kind to you. So that might be on your bucket list if you are interested in something like that.
Yeah, it's there'll be a time when I eat it for sure, when I run out of species to check off, or when I get experimental one year. But yeah, I don't know. There could be some other factors too, just because the prevalence of poisonings is so high in Colorado. It might be that our increased mining activity historically has caused some compound to leach into the soils they grow in, or our particular soil types, they pick up something, who knows. But it's such a commonly reported toxicity that I've just put it
in the Rockies.
Yeah.
So, on your chicken of the woods, I had the privilege of finding one, or a beautiful cluster in Manitoba, and it was on an alder stump.
Oh, wow.
But it was past its time for eating. It was beautiful, But as you know, that if it's too old, it's tough already. So you have to catch it just as you did in that photograph. And yes, then it's edible.
Yeah.
But, anyways, thank you so much. I'll
Thank
pass
you.
it on to someone else.
Ryan, you can unmute yourself if you'd like.
I was wondering how you cook the hawkswing. I'm someone that finds it bitter, and I've used it as like pulverizing, like cooking it up and then running it through a blender, then using a little bit in the soup as flavoring. But I
Mhm.
find I can't eat it just as like chunks. I find it too bitter, but if it's just a little bit, it makes a good base to a soup.
Yeah, it does have a ton of umami flavor, and that bitterness can be good in moderation. But I just eat it like any other mushroom. I slice them up and saute them in oil. I really like marinating them and grilling them. I dehydrate a lot of them to add in soups and stews. So, I have heard from one or two people that they found them less bitter after cooking them for a really long time. So you might try that. But generally, if you find them bitter, you're always going to find them bitter, which is sort of unfortunate.
Yeah, I did have that experience with one of the other ones that were a toxo, not a hedgehog, but I'm trying to remember which one it was. I think it was one of the hygrophorus where it says it tastes bitter to some people, and I was one of those people.
Oh yeah.
It's like when you taste it, it doesn't taste bitter, but then you cook it, it tastes really bitter.
Oh, interesting.
I'm trying to remember which one it was. But you mentioned it, and that's part of IDing it.
Mm.
Yeah, it wasn't tasty. I tried cooking it.
I haven't eaten too many hygrophorus, so I'll have to.
There's a really good gray one. I'm trying to remember the name of it.
Okay.
It's a gray cap that we found here. It's quite crunchy and mild.
Oh,
it's good.
Interesting. We have quite a few hygrophorus, so I'll have to add that to the list to research.
Neat. We are running a little over our time here, but if Martin wants to.
I just wanted to comment about the hawkswing. Yeah, the big thing I found, and actually I've been out foraging with David Aurora, and one of the things he cooked a bunch up and cooked them really well, and that's what I've been doing. And actually, we cooked a whole bunch up for a big Sorrentinos thing this year, and they were really good, but basically just about to the point where you're burning them, like you're cooking them really hard, and you get rid of that bitterness, and they actually have a lovely flavor. Nice mushroom.
Yeah, one of my favorites. Yeah, it's kind of a perplexing random instance of poisoning that I went through, so I'm curious and a little scared to experiment.
It's really unfortunate that happened to you. I think all of us have some kind of unintentional mushroom poisoning that we've experienced at this point.
Yeah, that was my first one ever.
Yikes. All right, if there are no more questions, Ryan, it was an absolute pleasure to have you. And if I wasn't drooling from what you were describing, I was eagerly taking notes. So I appreciate everything that you had to share.
Well, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. Please feel free to reach out. Hopefully you had time to write down one of those links to find me, but I'm pretty responsive to any sort of contact. So I'm always happy to answer follow-ups or do IDs or any of that stuff. I'd love to find time to get up there sometime and go out and experience your mushrooms.
Yeah, I feel like you would have a lot to offer in an in-person foray, maybe at GAMP for one of our larger events this in the summers that we host.
That would be a ton of fun. I would love that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Have a good night, and thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for having me.
Oh yes, and Erica also notes that there's lots of Hericiums that we have.
So. Oh, that would be great. We
Plenty
only
of
have
those.
we only have the one rare one here, so I'd love
Oh, awesome.
that. Thank you.